So, 5 o'clock pill, time to start today's webinar. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the topic of social impact bonds. Portugal happens to be the third country in the world with the highest number of social impact bonds, and we thought it would be very actual to host a webinar on the topic and learn more about impact bonds in general, as well as in the Portuguese context. For those who are joining us for the first time, I am Luísa Ferreira, Head of Social at European Investment Bank Institute, the philanthropic arm of the IB, the EU long-term financial institution, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Today, we have invited Margarida Anselmo, Head of Governance Performance at Maize Impact, a Portuguese impact investing company that was created in 2013. Before joining Maize, Margarida was seconded at Mars Center for Impact Investing in Toronto. Margarida will share with us the results of 3 Portuguese impact bonds, Projeto Família, which helps children and young people at risk of becoming institutionalized, Fast-Forward, and Bootcamps Academia do Código that tackle unemployment through programs for developing skills. With me today, I also have my colleague, Frank Lee. Frank is the head of the Financial Instruments Advisory Division at European Investment Bank, and he will share with us the bank's role and the experience on social outcomes contracting and the various advisory platforms available. Before I hand the mic to Margarida and Frank, a couple of logistic remarks. First, the webinar is being recorded and will be made available in a few days in our YouTube channel, where you also can find all the webinars we've developed in the last couple of years. Second, if you have questions for Margarida or Frank, please write them in the chat and use the option send to all panelists, and they will answer them at the end of the webinar. Thank you, and now I invite Margarida to join us. Margarida, the mic is yours.
Hey everyone, thank you so much, Luísa, for the invitation to be here today. It's really my pleasure to share a little bit of what Maize's experience with social impact bonds in Portugal has been so far. Just to briefly introduce Maize, we are a Lisbon-based organization who accelerates and invests in solutions that deliver impactful outcomes. And we look into social and environmental challenges. And we work in a bunch of different verticals. We do acceleration and investment. Actually, the European Investment Fund is the anchor investor in our MSM fund. But what brings me here today is essentially our public sector advisory work, which includes work in outcomes-based commissioning, specifically the structuring and managing of social impact bonds. This is the area where I've been working at Maize since I joined over 5 years ago. And just to set a little bit the context, last year was a really important year for us because 3 of the social impact bonds that we've been managing, these ones had started back in 2017. They closed last year, and we published the final reports for these SIBs in Portuguese back in the summer. And this last January, we published them again in English. And the idea was to share as openly as possible what our experience has been. They are quite detailed about like the small processes and logistical aspects of running a social impact bond. And really, we wanted to open the conversation to our international partners or organizations across Europe that are thinking about diving into social impact bonds. And yeah, they are available in our website, so please go and have a look. So I thought maybe it could be useful because I imagine that maybe some of the people in the audience today don't know exactly what a social impact bond is. So I thought I'll reintroduce the concept, and I apologize in advance for everyone that already knows what a social impact bond is. And I guess I will preface by saying that, especially for people that have a financial background, social impact bonds are not really financial bonds. So it will be easier if you detach those two concepts in your head. They are essentially a public-private partnership which is used to fund social services through performance-based contracts, with a very interesting feature, which is that in social impact bonds, most of the times the risk is entirely on the investor side and not on the public sector side. Maybe it's helpful to show this diagram. So essentially in a social impact bond, you have one or several social investors, which will provide the upfront capital to finance a social service. And the service provider or providers will provide the service to beneficiaries. And when a social impact bond is being set up, everyone in this kind of triad, so of social investor, government commissioner, and service provider, agree on the outcomes that are supposed to be achieved. So, for example, in the context of employment, it could be that 50% of beneficiaries have to enter employment within 3 months of finishing the program. You then typically have an independent evaluator which will verify whether these outcomes were achieved or not. And if they are achieved, the government commissioner will repay the social investors for their investment. If the outcomes are not achieved, then the loss stays with the social investor and the government commissioner doesn't have to pay anything. So essentially shifting the risk of the outcomes not being achieved towards the social investor. You might have heard about the term development impact bond, and very quickly, and I'm by no means an expert in development impact bonds, but the only key difference between a social impact bond and a development impact bond is essentially that the commissioner in a development impact bond is not necessarily the public sector of the country where the bond is being implemented. So it can be a donor, a multilateral organization, it can be a bunch of different combinations of things, but that's the only essential difference. So now that hopefully everyone sort of understands what a social impact bond is, I thought it would be useful to just share quickly what the landscape globally is. So the first social impact bond was launched in 2010 in the UK, was in the justice sector, basically preventing recidivism. And so far, 225 impact bonds have been launched, the vast majority of which are social impact bonds, some are development impact bonds, across 37 countries. And they are quite diverse. So you have an average number of beneficiaries of almost 12,000, but this is actually very skewed by a few very big social impact bonds. So more than half have less than 500 beneficiaries. So you have quite a few relatively small projects being financed through social impact bonds. Average contract duration is over 4 years, which is very interesting from the provider perspective, I would say. And they are really scattered across different sectors. So just for you to have a geographic impression of where these projects are being set up, I have to say that it's really hard to keep up, to stay updated on this. And so every time I prepare a slide like this, I feel like it's already outdated. But anyway, I think this gives you a good idea. And as Luisa mentioned, Portugal is the 3rd country in the world with the most SIBs launched, which is quite impressive, especially considering Portugal's dimension. There's a good reason for that, and I'll get into it later. And I think Frank will also talk a little bit about that. So talking about Portugal specifically, so there have been 23 social impact bonds launched in Portugal. You can see by the total investment committed that they are relatively small. And they are also scattered across a bunch of different sectors. The first one to be launched in Portugal was in education. And I think that also kind of set the stage for why there are so many impact bonds in education currently. Yeah, so I want to share, kind of tease something that Frank will get into as well, which is the Portugal Social Innovation Initiative, because it's very much linked to why Portugal has so many social impact bonds. So Portugal Social Innovation is essentially a public sector initiative that mobilized European funds in the 2020 funding cycle to promote social innovation in Portugal. So around 150 million euros were mobilized, of which 15 million were allocated to an outcomes fund. So to a pot of money whose only goal is to pay for outcomes in social impact bonds. And this pretty much allowed for a sort of standardized launch of a bunch of different social impact bonds in a row. And actually, of the 23 social impact bonds launched in Portugal, the only one where the outcome payer is not Portugal Social Innovation is the first one. Every social impact bond since has had the outcome payment come from this fund. So it was definitely critical to accelerate the adoption of SIBs in Portugal. And it was a very interesting case of European funds being used to promote outcomes-based commissioning. And actually the EIB group has kind of studied this example and produced some very interesting documents on it. I think Frank will talk about it at the end of this presentation. So what has been Maze's experience managing SIBs? So we've structured and done the performance management for 5 SIBs. That includes the first SIB to be launched in Portugal, which was Junior Code Academy. Essentially, the idea was to teach children the fundamentals of coding in the hopes that that would influence their cognitive ability as well as their grades in maths and Portuguese. And we've also structured and done the performance management for the following 3 SIBs to be launched in Portugal, which were the first to be launched under Portugal Social Innovation and are kind of the ones that bring me here today. So these 3. I will spoil already the surprise. Each of these SIBs had 9 contracted outcomes, and they were all achieved. So the Code Academy Bootcamps SIB, essentially the intervention model was Academia de Código developed coding bootcamps. So the idea was to reskill unemployed people as software developers. The Social Impact Bond financed 9 bootcamps. Each of them had 18 to 20 students. And the outcome that was contracted was for each of these bootcamps, at least 11 students had to enter the job market as software developers within 3 months of the end of their respective bootcamp. So in the end, 174 unemployed people went through these 9 bootcamps, and at least 101 entered the job market within the rules of the SIB, and so at least 11 for each of the 9 bootcamps, so all the outcomes were achieved. In the end, the total project cost was just under 700K, and it was really considered a huge success from all parties involved, and was very significant for the Fundão region, which is in the center of Portugal and where this SIB was implemented. And please read more on it in the report. You can find them. You can find it in our website. So Faz-Te Família supported. Essentially, Projeto Família works with the families of children and youth at risk. And the way the intervention model works is whenever a child is flagged as being at risk by Social Security, Projeto Família comes in and works with the families of these children in a bunch of parental and interpersonal skills to try and give them the tools to be able to safely keep their children with them. So in this social impact bonds, 180 children at risk were supported. That corresponds to 119 families. and at least 163 were kept safely within their families in the year after the intervention. The total project costs were around 440K. And finally, Fast-Forward, which was also an employment SIB, this time mostly focused on the development of soft skills and job readiness tools. So Fast-Forward worked with 150 young people. These were all either NEET or, so not in employment, training or education, or young people that were that had very high risk factors for becoming NEETs. So they work with these 150 people across 5 different editions of Fast-Forward, and they achieved both outcomes. So for each of the groups, they had 2 outcomes. The first outcome was that 40% had to enter the job market within a few months of the end of the program. And then it had a second outcome, which was maintenance of employment. And so half of the ones that entered the job market had to stay in the job market for at least 6 months. And the total project cost was around 390K. So, and I'm trying to be fast also so that we have time for questions. So I think the key takeaways from our experience structuring these projects and doing the performance management for this project is this takes a long time. It was around 4 years of following these interventions and dealing with the investors and with the outcome payer. And I would say that the overall message is that they were all a success in the sense that they all achieved the outcomes that were contracted, and that all the investors were really happy about what was achieved, as well as the service providers. And the feedback we have is that from the providers is that they've learned a lot from this process, and they also led to some internal change in the way they manage their projects, the way they manage their data. There were, however, 2 important, I would say 2 key learnings that are already informing the next generation of SIBs in Portugal, and we work very closely with Portugal Social Innovation to also make sure that these learnings are incorporated into the planning of what comes next. And the first one, and I would say from our experience at Maze, the most critical one, is the importance of making sure that the right public sector bodies have skin in the game from the beginning. And so if you have a social impact bond in employment, even though the outcome payment is coming from this central structure called Portugal Social Innovation, it's really important that the public bodies related to employment, so in this case, I would say the relevant ones would be the National Institute for Employment and the Institute of Social Security. It's really important that they are involved from the beginning for several reasons. First, to make sure that the outcomes that are decided between the partners are relevant in terms of Portuguese public policy, that the public sector really cares about these outcomes, that they are the right ones, and that they are ambitious enough. And also to make sure that when the projects are successful, that you have a pathway to incorporate the learnings that you make in these projects. So we found this to be a bit of a challenge at times, and something really important to consider since the beginning whenever social impact bond is being structured. And the other one is really the importance of reducing a bit of the administrative burden that is around this instrument. It's a very Portuguese case thing, also because Portugal Social Innovation channeled European funds, which come with their own rules. And it was a bit of a challenge in the beginning to understand how to use these funds for this very innovative type of outcomes-based commissioning. We got a long way in the last years, but I think there's room for even bigger improvement. So I think I would, I wanted to finish this and then give the stage to Frank by kind of going over the 10 common claims around SIBs. It was Brookings that kind of systematize this in this way. So these were the big promises of social impact bonds when they first showed up back in 2010. And I wanted to kind of match our experience with these claims and see where our experience validated these claims and where it hasn't really been our experience that SIBs bring about this kind of results. So essentially, one of the key claims around social impact bonds is that they help everyone focus on outcomes, and that has definitely been our experience. And from my personal perspective, one of the most powerful things about social impact bonds is that they are very effective outcomes contracting tool. So the idea that you tie the financing of a service to an outcome and not to an activity. So going back to our employment example, the idea that you pay per entry into employment and not per hour of training or per person trained is extremely powerful in driving results and in making sure that you don't get lost in the process and that you keep your end game at top of mind at all times. And the fact that we had 4-year projects where in every single partners meeting, the outcome, so entering into employment, was at the center of the conversation, is something that we should really not take for granted, because from our experience, that's not the case in a lot of project implementation. So SIBs really bring that focus to outcomes, and that's extremely powerful. The second claim around SIBs is that they drive performance management. And that has also been our experience. So for us to be able to know what's going on, if we are on the right track to achieve the outcomes that were commissioned or not, you have to set up kind of a data structure. You have to set up processes to share data between partners, to raise flags when things are not going at the rhythm that they need to go on. And you also, because the contract is around the outcomes, you also have way more flexibility to change the intervention, which is something very powerful. Because if after 6 months you understand that one of the modules, the training modules that you designed is not reaching, is not helping you reach the outcome, then you are free to change it and to do something that is more effective. So that is very powerful. And it's very interesting because from the providers that we've worked with, the majority of them have implemented specific data management systems for the SIB, which they have since expanded to the entire organization. So they tested tools with the SIB that they found really useful to be able to know what's going on, and that they are now using at the organizational level. So that's very powerful. Third claim is that social impact bonds create an incentive for collaboration. And our experience is, yes, for sure, we have had some really interesting conversations between investors, service providers, intermediaries, so us, MAIs, and the public sector. We think that we could go further, especially on the relationship with the public sector. And this is something that sometimes it's difficult to draw the line of the level of formality that is appropriate between the public sector and the other partners. But we think that it could definitely be more collaborative, and more learnings could be integrated into public policy throughout the projects. The fourth is build a culture of monitoring and evaluation. Yes, this is true, and it ties really neatly with the performance management point. However, we feel like this is also an area where we could go even further and kind of take advantage of the fact that you're already setting up quite a complex structure, because SIBs are complex, quite a sophisticated structure. That's also why they don't make sense for everything. And we think we could really take advantage of this to do even better quality impact evaluation. So since you're already investing so much in structuring the contract itself, sometimes we think we could have gone further in the quality of the evaluation tools used. Fifth point, investment in prevention. And again, yes, we see that in Portugal, SIBs are mainly financing things that are either preventative or like first level response to social problems. But again, we think we could put an even bigger focus on prevention. So it could be an even earlier stage intervention when it comes to the social problem life cycle. And finally, on the points that we definitely agree with, we have shifting risk away from government. So yes, definitely the social impact bonds that have been implemented in Portugal have shifted the risk around these interventions away from government, perhaps a little bit too much. So in the case of these SIBs, the risk for the government, I mean, this would be debatable, but was 0. And it could be interesting to think about more sophisticated risk distribution mechanisms. So perhaps the public sector could keep a little bit of risk, even if it's only by committing to doing something if the social impact bond is successful. And another aspect that we found interesting is that, and this is something that you see happening globally, is that whereas initially the idea was for 100% of the risk to be on the investors, it seems like in some contexts it's helpful to shift a little bit of risk to the service providers. So usually the service providers are not able to take a lot of financial risk. They don't have the cash flow for that, but it can be helpful in aligning incentives to shift a little bit of financial risk. They have a lot of reputational risk regardless, but it could be interesting in some cases to put a little bit of financial risk as well. And by providers, I include intermediaries like Maze on that equation. And then we have kind of 4 claims where the messages are a bit mixed, and we're not sure that this is happening, at least in the case of Portugal. So the first one is the crowding in of additional private funding. So this was one of the major arguments for social impact bonds when they were first conceived, was the idea that by providing competitive returns and a portfolio diversification solution, they would be a means of attracting a lot of additional capital into solving social problems. And in Portugal, this has not really been the case, especially because the internal rate of returns of the Portuguese SIBs is capped at 0. I know this is a bit technical, but there is a fiscal incentive, and that's interesting. So in the end, the actual return can be positive, but most of the investors in social impact bonds in Portugal were already putting money into the social sector. They are just changing the way they are using that money and gaining the possibility of recycling it, which is very interesting. But there are not a lot of new capital sources. Then the ability to achieve scale. We are not sure because not enough time has gone by, so it's still unclear what happens after the SIBs are over, because very few SIBs have ended so far. The idea that they help support experimental interventions, to some extent, yes, but interestingly, the intervention models that have been financed through social impact bonds, from our perspective, have been becoming less experimental. So we seem to be going towards intervention models that have shown results before, which is interesting. And finally, the last point is sustained impact. And here it's the same as with point 8, which is we really don't know because not enough time has gone by. So we'll need to wait a bit longer to see if in the long term, kind of the life paths of the beneficiaries that have been touched by the social impact bond. So people that went through Academia de Código, whether they are still employed as software developers, and if they had like much better career paths than they would have had otherwise, etc., etc. So we still need to wait a bit more to see what it looks like in the long run. And yeah, essentially this is it. I really invite everyone to check out the reports. You can just skim them, but I think if you're thinking of getting into social impact bonds, it can be an interesting way to understand what this means in practice. Like, what does it look like to the daily life of implementing and managing a social impact bond. So please check them out. And I will give the stage to Frank, who will talk about essentially the work that the EIB is doing in outcomes-based commissioning and social impact bonds. And in the end, we'll have time for questions. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot as well from my side, Margarida. A very interesting presentation. Indeed, it's difficult to pitch your presentation not knowing the level of knowledge, of course, amongst the audience, and you can either go into a lot of detail in terms of the outcomes and the learnings as you did there, or obviously stay high level and explain really more about how these things work. But it is a fascinating topic, and it is indeed one that's interested us, of course, within the EIB, particularly on the advisory side, which is where I come from. Louisa from the EIB Institute was kind enough to just give me a 5-minute slot with you today, and I don't want to steal the show, but it was really just to join up what you've heard today with what we are doing more widely in the bank, particularly on the advisory side. But also the EIB also has a sister organization called the European Investment Fund, and this is an institution which also invests in social impact bonds. It is actually the largest investor in this asset class in Europe, and obviously we're very excited about this particular way in which social innovation can be encouraged through changing the way in which the public sector procures social services, and in essence that is at the heart of what you see with social impact bonds, and in fact on the advisory side we tend to focus more on the topic that we call social outcomes contracting, which is of course connected, but the difference is that we try to focus more on the upstream work. In other words, building the capacity and raising the awareness of the public sector, the commissioners, as Margarida called them. These are the bodies that have to be, they're the starting point really of a social impact bond, and they are the ones that have to actually change their attitude and their way of working. Traditionally, procuring public services is really very much based on outputs as opposed to outcomes, and that's where we have found things get stalled really early on, and it comes back to some of the points that Margarida was saying. Getting buy-in, skin in the game, getting commitment from the public sector, so that the learnings from these often very small and experimental interventions can actually be taken on board and mainstreamed, and then adopted really as part of, as I say, mainstream public sector intervention. So what have we done? Maybe if we just move to the next slide, Margarida, thanks. So I just wanted to quickly highlight two advisory initiatives that we work on together with the European Commission. These are obviously EU based, but interesting nevertheless. The first one is a platform we call Compass, which is actually about promoting the use of European structural funds, or shared management funds as they are now called, across Europe in the area of financial instruments. And this is how we actually came across this topic originally, because on the one hand you need an outcome payer, which is usually the public sector, and then you need on the other side of it, which is the investors, as it were, into social impact bonds, and this is what we would deem to be a financial instrument. And we were quite focused on one end of the intervention at the beginning, which is the financial instrument side of things. And very, very fascinated when we came across the Portugal Social Innovation Initiative, which is what Margarida was mentioning. And indeed, this was the initiative that led to these good number of social impact bonds in Portugal. And we were fascinated as well because Portugal was the first country also to do this with the structural funds, as opposed to other forms of public funding, which added a certain amount of complexity to the situation. And it was one that we actually engaged with the Portuguese authorities on quite early on, to do a bit of brainstorming about how could this actually be done with European structural funds and what were the challenges. It was things like selecting fund managers, state aid issues, of course, which come into play when you get into this sort of topic. But anyway, it was great to see that this thing went ahead, and that the intervention on the Portuguese side was not just in supporting social impact bonds, but a whole range of interventions from very early stage all the way to later stage, supporting through venture capital type investment later on, and even lending. And we actually made 2 case studies on this, which you will be able to find more information on the FI Compass website, which is fi/compass.eu. I'll actually try to post the study for you in the chat in a minute. The first one was really on the Portuguese Social Innovation Initiative itself, and then actually we said, why don't we take the learnings of Portugal and actually try and spread this across EU? And we looked at this from the point of view of putting together a handbook and guidance for other authorities across Europe that may be interested in using this. And in fact, we have seen a number of member states, Lithuania, for example, that we're working on with now, that actually has really been, has been stimulated and inspired really by what the Portuguese done. And this is obviously great to see learnings and innovation being spread across Europe. So this is what we've done at Compass. And the last slide I have which is the next one, which is really another platform, essentially another mandate that we work with the European Commission on. It's the European Investment Advisory Hub, which is now called the InvestEU Advisory Hub. And here we were approached originally about 4 years ago by the Finnish authorities. They are also a member state that's doing quite a lot in this space. And Finland, under the EU presidency that they had a few years ago, actually wanted to promote this topic, and they therefore engaged with us again with a view to spreading their knowledge and best practice from Finland and other countries across the EU. And so under this, we set up something called the Social Outcomes Contracting Advisory Platform. Again, if you want to find out more, there you have the actual link on the slide. There you will find actually a lot of good case study material as well, videos that we made. And in Finland, a very interesting intervention in support of integrating refugees into employment, which of course is a very hot topic right now, and one that many member states probably would want to learn more about. So I would encourage you to have a look at that. And just finally to say, we're happy to obviously talk to public authorities in particular who are looking to experiment with this, share the knowledge, share the learnings, and potentially help them with some early feasibility work, or just looking and experimenting in the space. So that's it from me, and thank you very much also to Louisa for inviting us from the EIB Institute, and well done obviously to Margarida for the great presentation.
Thank you both to you, Frank, and to Margarida. I have a first question in the chat. I think Margarida already mentioned it, but maybe you want to develop it more. And I'm reading the question: would you be concerned that no public authority apart from the first SIB has become an outcome payer?
So I think, by the way, in the first SIB, the outcome payer was the municipality of Lisbon. So it's interesting that it was local government, not central government. I'm not concerned. I think it's normal that, considering that this money is available, there is no incentive for for different ministries, for example, or public institutes to put in money from their own budgets to pay for outcomes of SIBs when there's this pool of money available for them to use in their policy areas. So obviously the existence of a central outcomes fund kind of makes it almost impossible to structure a SIB like next to it. So it's not necessary, but that's why that money is there. It's also because it helps the public sector overcome a lot of problems that they would have if they were using their own budgets. For example, the issue with annual budgets and the difficulty that it would be for a specific ministry or a public institute to sign a SIB contract that lasts for 5 years, which will probably catch even a government change. So it's not concerning, it's to be expected. What is concerning is it's really important to make sure that the different public authorities, or the different ministries or the different public institutes, are learning from this experience, that there's a way for these learnings to stay within these organizations or these public bodies, so that when Portugal Social Innovation doesn't exist anymore, they have the know-how to do their own social impact bonds where the outcome payments come from their own budgets. So, I mean, there's no perfect solution. Obviously, Portugal Social Innovation allowed for a lot of experimentation to be done. It had that cost of not forcing different ministries to put their own money in the game. But I think overall it was a positive thing. But now we have to deal with that, right? Making sure that they are paying attention. I hope this answered the question.
Thank you, Margarida. I have another 3 questions, and Frank, also feel free to jump in and bring, the European the European perspective. And one is from someone from the Porto municipality, and her first question is, what should be our roles as a local government regarding SIBs? And then I will read you the second, otherwise I know it becomes overwhelming.
Well, hello, Porto. Well, I think it's interesting because in Portugal, there's more and more on the table the possibility of municipalities being investors in SIBs, with central government being an outcome payer, which is a curious setup. So it could make sense in some policy areas, the dynamic of like how these social services work and are paid for kind of justifies the municipalities being a co-investor. I think it's always interesting to have private investors from the bringing new money into the social space perspective, but I think municipalities can have that role. On the other hand, especially now you have, and I'm really starting to talk about things I don't know very well, but you have a lot of responsibilities in the social space being moved from central government in Portugal to local government. So as that happens, I think the potential for municipalities to become outcome payers, just like they were in the first SIB in Portugal, increases, because their interest in seeing these outcomes met increases a lot, because they have a clear financial incentive for these outcomes being met. So I would say both, depending on which policy area we're talking about.
And the second question, and I think it will be interesting if Frank also brings the experience from outside Portugal. When talking about social outcomes contracting at the municipality level, what important recommendations would you highlight from your experience? So maybe Margarida starts with Portugal, and maybe Frank wants to jump in with what's being done at European level.
Okay, well, yes, so I think the first thing, not sure if this is redundant, but you really need a champion in the public sector. Well, this is kind of regardless of whether it's at the municipal or the central government level, but you really need someone that is very invested in making it happen in the public sector. And most of the successful experiences, from what I've seen, have a champion, a public sector champion. So that would be critical at the municipal level. And another thing, to be honest, there's nothing from my experience that is particular to municipalities versus central government. But another thing is, I would really, I would invest a lot of time in the beginning. That's the whole idea of a SIB, in setting the ground for one, making sure that the know-how stays within the municipality. So making sure that the municipality would be able to do a SIB afterwards, that they have a way to keep the knowledge in-house, and that they are not just outsourcing this to an intermediary or something similar. And the other thing is to decide from the get-go, what are the consequences of this SIB? So what are you trying to test, and what's going to happen if you achieve the outcomes that you want to achieve? What's going to change as a result of that? I think that's something that's really important to keep on the table from the beginning. But I think Frank will know much more about this than I do.
No, I mean, I fully agree with everything that Margarida said. I mean, this seems to be also what we've experienced, you know, also from other places in Europe. I mean, it's interesting that we always thought that these things would be done mainly by central government, by ministries. But in fact, we've been approached, you know, quite recently, in fact, more by municipalities who obviously, you know, are interested in doing this stuff as well. And for example, we're working with Madrid right now on the topic of homelessness. And you know, I think the advice is, well, as Margarida said, spend enough time upfront building the capacity within your public sector, whether you're a municipality or national government, getting an understanding of what is actually as you say, what's the challenge that you're trying to overcome, what are the different solutions that are out there, because actually what you're trying to do at the end of the day is you're trying to bring new solutions that have somehow have the potential to provide additional benefit. It might be that, you know, a lot of public sector players want to go into this simply to save costs, which you know is not a bad incentive in itself, particularly now with public sector needing to save money in all sorts of areas. So the belief is that if you invest in prevention, you can save on greater costs that come from dealing with the cure in problems, and this often is the motivation why public sector goes into these things. But there's another dimension, which is that this intervention obviously leads to new ways of doing things, and you learn a lot from the public sector in terms of how things can be done better. And that's essentially what you're trying to do by procuring on the basis of outcomes. You're leaving it up to other players in the market to come up with solutions that will deliver those outcomes you want in a more efficient way or a more innovative way. And that means you have to have good capacity as a public sector. You need to understand what you're doing, because ultimately you need to then design the contract that will make sense for you. And therefore, you know, learning from others, you know, don't be afraid to talk to other people in the same situation as you. I mean, that's where we try to help out, to connect people within Europe who might be doing the same sorts of things. And yeah, I think, and try and keep it simple. This is not a simple thing, but this obviously the simpler you can make it. And what I mean is try to look at areas that are to some extent tried and tested, not particularly new sectors that have never been looked at before in Europe. Try to keep it simple in terms of if you are a municipality and you have a certain budget line and you're trying to save on a budget line, try and design something around that particular area of intervention. Don't make it complicated in the sense that it might actually impact on all sorts of other government interventions, because it can easily become a bit of a snowball effect. So that would be my advice, at least.
Thank you. Another question from Portugal, and The question is, why do you think it has been difficult to engage private actors as outcome payers in Portugal as part of their CSR activities?
I'm not sure if the person that asked the question really meant as outcome payers or as investors, but so as outcome payers, I think it wouldn't make sense. So but maybe it was a phrasing problem. So typically the role of private parties is to invest, right? Because the party that is the most interested in the outcome being achieved is the public sector. So there's this assumption that these outcomes, these social outcomes, are the responsibility of the public sector when we're talking about social countries, right? Socialist countries, as is the case of Portugal and most European countries. So I think maybe that was not the question. Maybe the question is why was it difficult to attract them to become investors in social impact bonds? So I would say that definitely the fact that the IRR in the case of Portugal is kept at 0. This is something that we'll see if can be changed in the next social impact bonds. So which means that basically SIBs in Portugal are not providing a competitive return. But the other thing, regardless of the potential IRR, I would say, but Frank will be able to speak more on this, is I think social impact bonds are still relatively unknown. And so I think regular investors sometimes don't really know how to look at social impact bonds, how to assess risk in a social impact bond. So someone that is going into it for the first time, like I think there's a level of a barrier to entry. That's why it's, I think, from the Portuguese experience, much easier for the investment in a social impact bond to come from a corporate social responsibility budget, for example, where typically it would be non-refundable grant making. And by investing in a social impact bond, it opens up the opportunity to recycle this funding. So instead of making a non-refundable grant, suddenly a corporate social responsibility department is financing a project, but maybe 4 years later is getting this money back and is able to finance another project. So in Portugal, social impact bonds have mostly mobilized foundations that were doing non-refundable grants, corporate social responsibility departments, and private investors that have a vested interest in the outcome, which happens in very particular situations. But for example, if you're talking about Fundão that is trying to create a technological hub, it's in the interest of a lot of the companies that are in Fundão for people to be skilled as software developers. So they have a vested interest in the outcome itself. So there are some exceptions like that, but yeah, other than that, I think until the IRRs get higher, and that will mostly depend on the public sector's willingness to pay for the risk, it will be hard to attract like regular investors. Frank, please save this intervention with much more insightful comments.
I think it's no, you made the right comment. It is you picked it up. I'm not sure whether the question is an error or not. I mean, I think there's room obviously for private sector / let's say philanthropic investment / endowments to come in on either side of this equation. It's true, of course, that outcomes payments by definition means that you pay out and you don't get anything back. I mean, other than, of course, other externalities and benefits from the intervention. But it's also I think a bit about how the risk is shared, which is also a point that you touched on earlier, Margarida. I think there is a perception that for investors coming into this, that this is a highly risky intervention because it's largely untested, etc. I think the more of these things that happen, the more that investors understand what service providers can do, and the more that this is measured and reported on, the lower that risk perception is going to be And then you get to a point where actually you can start to make potentially returns and start to attract again more mainstream investors who might be a bit more comfortable with this. The other option, and that was something we were really fascinated with at the beginning, was how could we de-risk this stuff for private investors, so provide guarantees or something, again using public money on the investor side. So many different thought processes around this. It's not an easy topic, but I guess it's just about raising awareness of what this is, which is also what Margarida said. I mean, it's not very well known, and unfortunately, it is pretty small scale stuff. So in terms of getting the interest and attraction from larger corporates or larger philanthropic investors, this is still a challenge.
I have one maybe final question for you, which is a colleague that asks, could you please dig into what issuers/final beneficiaries might lose in case of non-achievement of targeted outcomes, assuming the risks be shifted fully to third parties of the private or public sector? Shouldn't there be a clearer set of incentives, penalties, to cater for an effective alignment of interests? I don't know who wants to start.
Frank, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, my first comment is we shouldn't let colleagues come on these panels because they always ask tricky questions. And thanks to Miguel for that one. I think. I mean, this actually comes to the heart of the risk sharing thing that Margarida was talking about, and how do you balance? You know, what are the kinds of risks that the public sector should take in this, and what are the kinds of risks that the private sector is willing to take on this? I mean, it's like similar kinds of products that you see, whether it's PPPs or other forms of intervention in other sectors. But of course, the problem, particularly in this area, is that you are talking about a social problem, and if the private sector intervention is not successful, the problem doesn't go away, and the problem then remains for the public sector to clean up, let's say. And this is to be honest, this is one of the reasons why many countries are not going with this intervention. But you know what we say is that's why you need to experiment with this, do this at small scale, and see, you know, experiment it where you have not that much to lose, if you see what I mean. And then if it makes sense, then you look at how you scale this up so that you reduce the risks of failure, essentially, which as I say, ultimately rests with the public sector one way or another if it doesn't work. Can you penalize the private sector, which is another question, I guess. Can you penalize them? Well, the penalty is that they lose their money, of course, and I guess that's, you know, if they don't succeed, they don't get paid, and in essence, that's the risk that you're obviously trying to transfer onto the private sector. That's the penalty. It's a financial penalty, but okay, everyone knows that the problem doesn't solve itself in that situation. You still have people homeless, or you know, people going back into prison, or whatever the problem was that you're trying to sort out. That doesn't get sorted out. But okay, one might argue that you haven't really lost much because you're still left with the system that was there before, let's say, and that's the one that you're trying to change in the first place.
Margarida, would you like to add something, or you'd rather to maybe answer the last question I have in the Q&A?
You want to say what the last question is, and then maybe I'll.
The last question is whether do you already have any hint on the impact of the SIBs on the mental frames of public officers?
Okay, it's a difficult one. So I'll make a comment on the previous one very quickly. So I think the idea of completely de-risking the service providers in the beginning, or taking the risk away from them, was that they couldn't take it, the financial risk. It's not necessarily the case. Maybe they can take a bit of this risk, and that's good for alignment incentive, as was pointed out in the question. But I will say that, for example, at least in the case of the SIBs that we've managed, the reputational risk for the providers was really big, because the investors, so the ones that are really worried about whether the outcomes are met or not from the financial perspective, the investors that invested in these SIBs are very important funders for these providers. And the providers really don't want the investors to be disappointed in the way they conduct their work. So I have to say that in this case, there was a very strong incentive for the providers to do their best to achieve the outcomes. But of course, that clearly we would be moving in the direction of putting a little bit more financial risk on the providers just to align incentives even better. On the last question, can you, sorry, Luisa, can you just repeat
whether you already have any hint
of how it's influencing the public sector?
Frames of the public officers. Maybe it's going to be the next study by Mays.
Or by the EIB. Yeah, I think, you know, I would say in some policy areas, you see a bigger evolution than in others, because this is very sectorial, at least that's what we see happening in Portugal. So while you have some areas, I will not say which seem to be paying more and more attention to this and taking it more and more seriously, you have others where it's still really far away from being a concern or a priority. In terms of, generally speaking, outcomes-based commissioning, not specifically SIBs, the idea that you pay for outcomes and not for activities or outputs. So in some sectors, this is becoming, like it's becoming more and more part of the conversation, sometimes without the name social impact bond. That doesn't matter. It's more about the, I think, like Frank said, this is about the outcomes-based philosophy. If SIBs become irrelevant, that's not a problem. What is most relevant here is that you start thinking in terms of outcomes. I have to say that there's a big challenge in the public sector, which is government change. Every time the government changes, you lose momentum, and you kind of have to start not from scratch, but you give a couple of steps back, and typically that also comes with changes within the public institutes. And so that's always a challenge that you need to, every time there's a political cycle, you need to do a lot of work of just to go back to the place where you were before. But we're getting there. We're not giving up.
Thank you. I've seen that in the meantime, there were many questions popping up, but we reached the end of the webinar. This means that the topic is a very attractive topic for many others. So we might organize later in the year another seminar, webinar on the topic. So thank you so much. We'll be launching a short survey on so you can tell us about the webinar. Thank you, Margarida. Thank you, Frank. And thank you for having stayed with us for the audience.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.